So the resilience of Western societies, coming back to your original question, is quite weak. We are not ready to respond against countries like Russia or China who are mobilized, in effect. Russia is fully mobilized for war, both in terms of its industrial base and how it approaches statecraft. And China is building world-class military, 2.5 million People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Navy. While it is smaller in terms of displacement than the US Navy, it's actually numerically larger than what we are. And the Chinese are investing in building a world-class military.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. The West stands at a crossroads. After decades of unchallenged power, liberal democracies of Europe and America now face a world they no longer command. It's a world of fragmenting alliances, rival empires, and fading confidence. In this episode, returning guest Professor Andrew A. Michta joins The Focus to dissect what he calls the West's civilisational test. Drawing on his recent essays in RealClearDefense, he argues that the real struggle is not only against Russia or China, but against the West's own loss of belief. Together we examine whether America's era of primacy is ending, if Europe is ready to lead, and whether moral clarity and strategic courage can still anchor a Western civilization in doubt. This is a conversation about power, but also about purpose. Andrew, welcome back to The Focus.
Delighted to be here, John. Thank you for having me.
Western unity, Andrew, feels weaker than ever. France hesitates, Germany is cautious, the US is divided, and NATO juggles competing agendas. But then there's also a subtext to all of this, and that is that the threats that we had prepared ourselves to face are no longer the threats that we are facing. We have these hybridized situations where, criminal gangs are being employed by Russian intelligence to do damage to various parts of European infrastructure, which makes it exceedingly difficult to actually work out who the bad guys are and drawing the line back to Moscow. I mean, we've attempted to do it, but it's not resonating with the public. And of course, in any war, you need the public on side. You need them to understand what they're fighting so they can get behind it. Do you think that our Western governments are doing enough to educate the public in order for them to be, well, dare I say, mobilized, at least not, if not in a physical capacity, at least then in a sort of emotional capacity behind the state to counter what the Russians are doing, because what the Russians are doing is very clever.
In a nutshell, no. Facing what we're facing in the West, John, and that is probably true to a varying degree in the US, in Europe, in Canada, and probably on your side of the globe as well. We are going through a process where our leaders are not speaking the truth, are not arguing. And when I say are not speaking the truth, I mean not addressing the gravity of the situation. Maybe they themselves don't believe that the situation is as grave as I believe it is. We're coming out of 3 decades of basically a strategic pause. We took a vacation from history. If you look at the disarmament in Europe, especially in the largest economy like Germany, the Bundeswehr is a pale shadow of what it used to be. The British Army, depending on who you talk to, 40 to 70,000. It will take the Brits 10 years to field a division. And we've lived in this world where we talked ourselves into believing, remember the famous notorious essay, The End of History, the unipolar moment, that we experienced some sort of unimaginable ideological triumph, that our former adversaries will absorb the lessons and follow our path. A colleague who is in one of the major think tanks here in Washington said, we offered the Russians a seat at our table. And my answer to her was, no, the Russians wanted a table of their own. You don't understand how the system actually works. And, once I said that fat times produce managers, they don't produce leaders. And if you look at the West, and you see this in Europe, Europe was rolling in butter for 30 years. And it produced the kind of managers rather than leaders that that are not able to face up to the kind of tough environment that we see today. The second point I would make, John, is that we live in the world of legacy institutions. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is there. It's enlarged. It's now 32 members, which makes it even less manageable than it used to be. And all the while, there's no shared sense of threat perceptions. During the Cold War, whether you lived in France or Western Germany or the UK, if the balloon went up, you were in the same boat. Right now, you have a regionalized security optics. Countries that are on the flank have a keen sense of Russian threat. For the Estonians or the Latvians or the Lithuanians, it's existential. If they become occupied, they'll be destroyed. Germany is no longer a frontier state. It's got buffers in the east. It's unified. It tried to manage the relationship with Russia, relying on economic and political means. When I'm in Paris, I hear that actually, the southern direction is very important, that Europe's southern border now is not on the Mediterranean, it's in the Sahel, it's in Africa. When I get to Portugal or Spain, all I hear is migration and nothing really about Russia and the rest of it. You add to this the fact that China is now a power in Europe. It's so embedded in the economic structures. It may be geographically removed, but it is shaping the future of Europe. And the United States itself, I'm back from Germany. I spent 7 years working for the Defense Department in Germany, and then I returned in 2023 to Washington. We are fractured, we're polarized, ideologically, culturally. The problem of in-migration in the United States, probably not on the same scale as in Europe, but nonetheless, whether you believe official statistics that we've had 11 million illegals who crossed, or maybe what I tend to believe closer to 20 million, you're talking about the problems, the stresses, the issues of criminality, not vetting, not knowing the people who come in, and then the reaction of the native-born population against that. So the resilience of Western societies, coming back to your original question, is quite weak. We are not ready to respond against countries like Russia or China who are mobilized, in effect. Russia is fully mobilized for war, both in terms of its industrial base and how it approaches statecraft. And China is building world-class military, 2.5 million People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Navy. While it is smaller in terms of displacement than the US Navy, it's actually numerically larger than what we are. And the Chinese are investing in building a world-class military. And the West is churning. We are wealthy, but being fat is not the same thing as being strong. And I think that's where we are.
This morning, when I woke up over my early morning cup of coffee, I had a look at the YouTube scroll to see what was interesting, and I came across something, and I'd like to actually put it to you, and that is, in all the things that you've mentioned, especially during the two essays you put out in Real Clear Defense in September and in October, Ukraine is really a crucible for the West in a way that I don't think people really fully understand. Because if we take the Ukrainian desertion rate from the Ukrainian army, for instance, that shows that if Ukrainians aren't willing to clearly see their role in defending their own territory, why the hell should the West? And I thought to myself, that's quite devastating because it shows a weakness not just in the West, but it also shows a weakness in Ukraine, a country that we're supporting in war, because we don't know what we ought to be doing. We've got this multivarious kind of approach to Ukraine. We give them tomahawks, we don't give them tomahawks, we give them patriots, we don't give them patriots. We don't know what we're doing effectively. And then the Russians have a plan. They're hiring thugs all over the continent. They're torching factories, planning assassination attempts against corporate members of Europe's growing defense industry base. They are doing stuff and they've got a willingness to do stuff. And I can't see how we're countering it very well. And I have to, and as sad as it is, I have to bring Ukraine into this argument as well, of Western weakness, because I see that irrespective of what they've managed to do, and they've done great, they still are, 10 times smaller than Russia. And the Russians, like them or hate them, they have a plan and they are carrying that plan out.
So, two things that I would say here. First of all, when the Biden administration, when President Biden said, that we will stand up and we will not allow the Russians to continue, I was very proud of that moment because that expressed the American
Hmm.
geostrategic DNA, so to speak.
Sure.
Then what followed was total mess. I mean, we have no strategy for Ukraine. We never had.
Mm.
We were self-deterring in effect. Jake Sullivan, Secretary Blinken, the Russians played the nuclear card, threatened. There was always this debate, as you indicated, red lines. Do we give them HIMARS? Do we give them F-16s and all?
Yeah.
I spent 7 years while I was working in Germany, working very closely with the Ukrainian military. General Dayton was an advisor to the Minister of Defense, so I frequently had contact with them. And I was convinced of two things. Number one, that they would fight. You may remember the Western intelligence community was looking at the situation in Ukraine, and we were seeing what the Russians were doing. We were trying to warn them off, declassifying intelligence, saying don't do it. When they started distributing plasma to units, I mean, I was pretty much convinced that we're going to go in. And where Ukrainians surprised everybody, and that did not surprise me, I was convinced they would fight like mad,
Yeah.
is that they stood up and fought. Which brings me to a larger question here, because we need to be fair to what the Ukrainians have been through. And I have great admiration for their determination, their patriotism, and the suffering that they're undergoing. They're fighting with one hand tied behind their back when it comes to Western assistance.
Yep.
And Russia, until recently, was largely excluded from retaliation. That was a very strange war, if you will. When I look at the current situation, I have a sense that when President Biden said we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, I thought that was one of the most ill-conceived ideas. There are no forever wars. There's no such thing as for as long as it takes. It may be a nice political phrase, but if I had a colonel come up to me and say, I've got an operational plan for you, we're going to fight for as long as it takes, I would ask him to go back to the drawing board. So we did not create the end state. We did not express what strategy we wanted to achieve. What's really sad to me is that I'm convinced the Ukrainians had a chance to defeat the Russian military on their territory during their first offensive, but we didn't give them the means to do so. The Russians had no logistics, they had no leadership, and most of all, they had no defenses. They drove in with, some 170,000 troops, whatever the actual number was, in columns expecting another Crimea, and got bloodied and beaten. Granted, the Ukrainians were also lucky. What am I driving at? When Ukraine became independent in 91, it had 51 million people, roughly. When the Russians invaded for the second time in 2022, there were fewer than 40 million. When I look at the situation right now, Ukraine probably has somewhere between 25 and 28 million people left in the country.
That's a huge depopulation. It's
Huge
huge.
depopulation. It's out migration. It's, of course, women and
Yep.
families that are
Yep.
leaving.
Yep.
But the biggest problem Ukraine has is not so much weapons and munitions, it's people. Russia has probably 1 to 4
Mm.
population advantage. So in a war of attrition, when you're basically grinding, you know how this is going to end,
Mm.
unless there is a decisive shift in the strategy. And so far, we have not allowed that to happen. I will I will quote a conversation that I had with a Ukrainian parliamentarian in 2023, where she said, look, you're going to give us the F-16s, you're going to give us HIMARS, you'll give us ATACMS, but it may be too late because every nation has a breaking point. And I think you're referring to that, the fatigue, the exhaustion, the barbarism of what the Russians are doing is appalling to me.
Yep.
Drones and missiles hitting kindergartens and killing children, and forget just hitting power plants and the rest of it. And yet we're operating on the assumption that this is war over territory. It is not war over territory. President Trump, saying, okay, we're going to negotiate, you take so much of Donbass, this and then the other.
Yeah.
That is not what the Russians are doing. I consume a lot of Russian media and watch, and follow their propaganda. This is a civilizational war. This is the war for reconstituting the empire. Let me use a historical parallel here, John. If you think about what happened in interwar Germany after the First World War and before the Second started, during the Weimar Republic, the narrative that was developed in Germany was that the Reichswehr was never defeated, that Germany was betrayed. The Germans called it the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back. That gave them Hitler, who came and said, I'm going to rebuild your glory of German folk and the Reich. And it took the combined resources of the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain to really break the back of German imperialism. It ended with the partitioning of the country, occupation, transformation. And the Germans had to figure out how to be a normal state, right? Well, I think the 90s in Russia were their Weimar. And the kind of decomposition of the economy, of society, Yeltsin's figure, corruption that went in there. Arrival of Putin was almost uncanny in terms of the parallels that I'm drawing. And I know I can over-rationalize history, but bear with me. Putin's narrative to his people is, you're a great Russian people, you were betrayed. You were not defeated. The NATO never defeated the Red Army. There was no war. There were no missiles going off. We were betrayed by cowardly Gorbachev, drunken Yeltsin, Muscovy duck, whatever, most of all the West. And I will restore what the Russians call Veliki Ruski Mir, the great Russian Pax Russica, if you will. And I think that imperial drive, the relitigation of the end of the Cold War, is what this war is really all about. Russia wants to reconstitute the East European Empire. It already has Belarus. It's a de facto Russian province, even though formally it's still run by Lukashenko, but their military is fully integrated with the Russian military and the command structure. And if they have Ukraine, they will have reconstituted the core of imperial Russian territory. If you look at the historical references, the great Russians, the Russians proper, what they call the little Russians, the Ukrainians, and then the Belarusians, that's the core of the Eastern Slavic core. And then the Russians will require participation in European politics. Why is this possible? I would argue because in addition to Putin's drive, we've lived through 20 years of appeasement in the West. I'll give you very concrete examples. Putin invades Georgia. What are the consequences? Virtually none. Slap on the wrist, Nord Stream 1 is completed. He invades Crimea, again, slap on the wrist. Nord Stream 2 is started. He butchers Syrians at Aleppo. He's now a great player in the Middle East again. Oh, maybe he will have impact on the migration flow. Then he watches how we pull out of Afghanistan, not our finest hour, John, to put it politely. And he decides the Americans can't do anything. They're incapable of competent action. I'm going to go and consume Ukraine. Small states can defeat great powers because there's a temporal dimension to war. Think Finland during the Winter War against the Soviet troops coming in. Yes, Finland lost some territory, but it preserved its sovereignty to a degree. It's the Polish-Soviet War, 1919-1920. So the Ukrainians were in a position initially to actually do this. There was the best motivated, the best trained army that was attrited in the second offensive for the most part. How this ends will define the future of transatlantic relations. Yeah. Not only how Europe rolls with China. Think about it. If he's fighting a civilizational war, he will defeat not just Ukraine, but he will defeat the West. He will score a civilizational win. And I don't think enough people among Western leaders appreciate what is now riding on Ukraine, because we've committed our power, our prestige, and our money to that fight. And the Russians are not fighting Ukraine, they're fighting the West. I was in a conversation in Ramstein a couple of years ago when an assistant secretary to NATO, Assistant Secretary General, said, does it really matter that we say NATO is not at war with Russia when the Russians say they're at war with NATO? We still, I think, coming back to your original question about leadership and why the West is so fractured, we still have not articulated those kinds of problems to our population. If it's like the old saying, you may not be interested in the revolution, Trotsky, right? But the revolution may be interested in you. Uh,
Yeah.
we are operating on the assumption that somehow we can wall it off, negotiate a deal. And I tell you, even if the Russians agree to some sort of territorial deal and we, browbeat the Ukrainians to accept this, this will not be the end of the story. He will rearm. He is actually rearming right now. If you look at the reconstitution of Russian forces, those officers in Russia who survive will be combat tested, much better than the Serdyukov army that existed there before. And he will move forward. I mean, I think the Russians, it was very clear, John, in 2022, when Lavrov was saying we need to get back to the situation in Europe from 1997, what did that mean? Americans out, NATO enlargement nullified, some sort of sphere of influence agreement with the great European powers, especially Germany, so that the Russia would have a say on energy policy. It's basically loss of sovereignty for Central Europe and the Baltic states and the Finns. This is what's at stake.
Just on that, Andrew, I mean, I've got to ask the question because it's very obvious. It's screaming at me at the moment. Does Putin have a friend in Trump with regard to the thing that you've just said? Keep Europe weak, keep it disempowered, keep it as a marketplace at best, and maybe get rid of that because, of course, in the world of neo-capitalism that we're living in, we don't want to have rivals to the United States, so wipe that out as well. So is there something that's going on behind the scenes that we ought to be even more aware of? And it speaks to the character of the nation states involved and their ability to put forward their realist vision of themselves.
Yeah, look, the personal relationships that you have here, and President Trump says frequently that he's got great working relationships with Xi, with Putin, all of that. That aside, I don't think this is really what's at the core of what's happening right now. The most important thing is this, and I think the Europeans don't appreciate this, and your Australian audience, I think, should think about it long and hard. My nation is coming out of 20 years of the so-called global war on terror. We fought scheduled wars. The estimated cost of GWAT is about $8 trillion if you want to believe Watson Institute out of Brown University. I think they're pretty accurate on that. One half of 1% of American population, the US military, fought these wars, their families, their friends, and suffered casualties. The nation is fatigued. The outcomes in strategic terms are limited at best. We have not, I mean, we broke a lot of militaries, we decapitated a number of states that we considered, threats at that time. But did we really achieve our objectives? We're chasing jihadis over the mountains, John, while Russia and China were rebuilding their military structures. The Russians rebuilding the Chinese building. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we don't have our national security strategy published yet, but the ongoing debate that you hear is almost disconnecting the Atlantic theater from the Pacific theater. It's a conversation where what to me is one problem set. To me, the Atlantic and the Pacific are part of the same conversation. If you look at the map, our hemisphere is peripheral to where the Eurasian landmass is, but we're quintessentially a maritime power. We have the Navy written into our Constitution. If you look at the map and American positioning in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, we're basically a continental island. We're like Great Britain on a continental scale. So for us to be prosperous and to be secure in our homeland and to access global resources, we need to be anchored both in Europe and in Asia. But the conversation has shifted ever since Obama started talking in 2012 about pivot to Asia,
Which
uh,
never happened.
which never happened.
Yeah.
But we now have an entire cohort, John,
Mm.
who are talking in those terms.
Mhm.
I was on a panel with Elbridge Colby. He's now Undersecretary of Defense, of War, for strategy and planning. And I think he's very much involved in drafting the new strategy. And my take has always been, Bridge, great powers don't pivot. That's number one. Number two, that's not how you build strategy. The argument is that the American people will not spend more on defense. Remember, last year we spent only 3.1% of our GDP on defense. Our NDA authorized military joint force was at 1.3 million. That's half of what the Chinese alone are fielding. The Russians are putting 1.5 million people under arms. That's their goal. The Chinese are building 1,500 warheads by 2035. That's in the open source out there. So we have a military, and if you look at recruitment shortfalls that we had last year, we have a military that's probably structured for one theater. Well, my argument has been in this conversation on the panel with Colby was that you don't do strategy this way. You don't count how many crayons you have in the box and they say, okay, I've got 11, so I'm going to, draw on half the canvas. What are our irreducible interests? And then you make the case, coming back to your original question, to the American people, why defense spending is important. Remember also that this kind of pull inwards, Donald Trump saying America needs the me time. We need to focus on ourselves, make America great again, and all the slogans that are there. America first. Well, quite frankly, I cannot imagine any president not saying America first, as I can't imagine any prime minister in Australia saying, not Australia first. This is obvious, but that sense of enough of defending the fat Europeans, enough of, expending American resources here and there, to a point that some people are saying that we should actually move to hemispheric defense. This is where Greenland and Canada fall into it, and the high north. And in
And
effect,
perhaps Venezuela can be added to that if
could
things go
be, all
pear-shaped.
right.
Yep, yep,
And
yep.
you have to admit the United States has neglected both the domestic aspect of our security. This is the homelessness that you see, the kind of impoverishment, especially in areas where the industry shut down. We farmed out about 35% of our manufacturing. We only have 11% of our population employed in manufacturing, John. We have a huge economy, but this is a service economy for the most part. It's based on capital flows and it's based on digital output. So we're in a situation now, we're staring at a major manufacturing power in China that's rapidly translating that muscle into military capabilities. And we really are trying to use a political sleight of hand to say, okay, we're going to pivot to Asia, or we're going to focus on the Indo-Pacific, let the Europeans defend themselves because they're fat and capable. And quite frankly, I consider the fact that the Europeans have disarmed, except for the flank countries, and relied on the United States to be appalling. Europe has about 500 million people, John. It's got the GDP that dwarfs the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation is a pale shadow of the former Soviet Union. 140 million people, roughly, compared to what the Soviets were. The Soviets had 54 non-Soviet Warsaw Pact divisions in Eastern Europe. At the snap of a finger, they were sitting in the middle of Germany. This is not really comparable. And yet the Europeans are unable to bring themselves to respond. You have constant violations of airspace, exclusive economic zones. Drones are flying in. You had 3 MiGs in Estonia within 10 miles of Tallinn. Can you imagine that, fully armed? And the Secretary General says, no, we're not going to shoot them down. We will elegantly escort them because that's showing our power. On the contrary, for the Russians, there's a sign of weakness.
Oh, I agree
This,
with that, Andrew. But
yeah,
if I may just say,
sure.
last night we recorded with Piotr Kaczynski, who's an EU expert, and I think it's great that I'm speaking to you right now, a person who's very well versed in hard power, because I got a very good breakdown and quite an excellent lecture on how the EU sees things, and it's very different from what you're saying, because what I got from Piotr was that the European Union is moving. Yes, it's moving slowly, but that's a consequence of the democratic processes, the European Parliament, the European Commission. They are generating speed, but just not sufficient. And I did
To
raise
do what?
the
To
I
do
did raise
what, John? To
say
do
again.
what? What are
Well,
they trying
this
to
is the
do?
point, right? I did actually say, there are people that I know in Europe who question all of this and that they are very deeply unhappy with the way things are playing out in the European space. And I did make mention, actually almost verbatim, that, there is this American notion that during the 1990s in particular, but it's been since the creation of the EEC and morphing into the EU, that the Europeans grew fat and happy under the American military because the American military protected Europe. Yes, there was the Cold War imperative, but then after the Cold War imperative, that didn't change. There was no one had that conversation between Brussels and Washington to say, "Hey, hang on, everything's changed now. Maybe it's about time that you actually lift your game." And we're talking 30 odd years ago. So you're right, there is this huge time lag between then and now, and a lot of damage has been done. So is it sufficient for someone from the European Union to say, but Andrew, we're gradually developing things. We have a process. That process, admittedly, is very slow, but it's organic and we're growing it from the grassroots up. What does someone with your military experience think about something like that? And also from your American background, because here I think culture has a lot to do with this, yeah?
Well, forgive me that I was laughing because when I hear
It's okay.
somebody from the EU telling me that what's happening is organic, from the grassroots, then I have a couple of Brooklyn bridges I can sell them at a discount. I mean, this is the processes in Europe are anything but organic. They're elite driven from the top, number one. Number two, the EU has always had a democracy deficit. I mean, yes, the European Parliament is maybe representative, but even there, this is all, managed as a process. The European Commission, that's inside deals that have nothing to do with the electorate and the popular wishes. The Green Deal Energiewende that the Germans put in place, it's an elite project superimposed on the people. The Mercosur deal where you will import food from Mercosur, from Latin America without the same level of regulation that you have on European food production. It's going to pretty much blow up the agricultural structures in Europe. All of that. Look, the European Union is an incredible success when it comes to economic integration. Uh, Schengen, which now is pretty much dead. There's no more border free travel in Europe. There are polizei at every entry because the migration that happened in 2015 that the Germans actually facilitated to a large extent. I was in Germany at that time when Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das, we'll manage it." And you had this incredible flow of migrants coming into Europe. Um, but the European Union is a treaty-based organization. And I always tell people such organizations should not masquerade as nation states. The
Well,
EU is
here's the thing, Andrew. Piotr did say that the European Union is not a nation state, nor does it want to become one. So, if that's the case, and the only thing standing between a stable Europe moving forward is NATO, and we have to question the strength of the transatlantic alliance at this stage, and yet, as we continue this discussion, there is a question that I have for you on that score. Where does that leave Europe? I mean, if Brussels isn't a nation state, even if it's pretending to be otherwise, this is a huge problem. I mean, it's a huge problem for Europe and the world and the United States.
So the European elites talk about federalizing the European Union. This is
Yeah.
not really federalizing. This is really centralizing. And in a fashion, if you abolish the veto, if you go for qualified majority voting, it's like in the US, you would abolish the Electoral College, and only
Right.
the states of California and New York would decide what the policy would be. And I would remind your audience that Wyoming has maybe 500,000 people, but it has two senators and only one congressman, but it does have representation. So, look, a couple of things that happened. Number one is when the British left the European Union, two things happened. The second largest economy departed,
Yeah.
and the closest ally of the United States left. The EU became a much more continental and Germany run project because even though we talk about Franco German partnership, the heft of the German economy is such that the French are increasingly playing a lesser role in this arrangement.
Mm.
And what is happening right now is an effort to centralize. The new Union Treaty is going to, in effect, transfer ever more power to Brussels. And I don't want to be too crass about it, but if you look at the structures that are emerging, it will allow Berlin to essentially dominate and run the European Union as an enterprise. All of this is run in the context of talking about, Europe this, Europe that. Look, the idea that you can stitch together nations that have thousands plus years of history that are so diverse and so different into some sort of a supranational structure and have it also perform functions that NATO right now performs. Who's going to provide the nuclear umbrella? Who's going to provide high-end enablers? Who's going to provide sensors and targeting? And I always tell my European friends, instead of reinventing the wheels and talking about strategic autonomy and all this, pardon me, John, nonsense that I hear over and over again, why don't you do what you should be doing? NATO has 3 new regional plans. Everybody accepted them at the Vilnius summit, which means these are obligations. Those obligations have capabilities requirements attached to them. Europe should provide the core of conventional force in NATO. The Americans, their own component, high-end enablers, targeting, and most of all, the nuclear umbrella. Who? The French will provide the nuclear umbrella for Estonia? The Spaniards will come to defend Latvia? Who are we kidding? So my point is, it is an overreach by the elites to be talking in those terms. Instead of strengthening the transatlantic leg, they're playing into the hands of those in the United States who are saying, let's leave the Europeans alone, let's ignore them. It will take Germany a decade to rebuild its military. The defense industrial base, systems integration, sensors, high-end stuff. Without the Americans, the Ukrainians would not be able to fight for as long as they had. Without American logistics, nobody in Europe has the capability to provide, even to move things, people, equipment, and munitions. And I could go on and on. So I'm with all due respect to all the people who talk about how the EU will emerge as a unitary actor and we will have this multipolar system, look at the reality of it all. How effective are the Europeans when it comes to charting their own national security policy? I remember I was at the Munich Security Conference when J.D. Vance delivered that speech that upset everybody. And I remember Merz walking out, oh, we have to become more independent of the United States because Trump, because this, because that. And then all of them got on the plane, arrived in Washington, sat down politely on the couch and said how important the relationships with the United States. You talked about what happened in the 30 years post-Cold War. Listen, look at the German economic model at that time, right? Well, to produce machines and fertilizers and the rest of it, to have this kind of export economy that Germany was relying on, you need cheap energy. Well, you were getting cheap Russian gas. And at the same time, you were shutting down nuclear reactors. What else did you need? You need a market in components. You got that in China. And then you had the Americans to defend you so you don't have to spend on military and defense issues. What's not to like? If I could get the Australians or the Canadians to defend me, I'd say, yeah, let's do this. My point is, living in the world of institutions and the kind of elite top-down governance, look at the politics in Europe. AfD is now, I think, the largest political party, and it's likely at some point to form the government. I don't like their politics. I have a lot of issues with what they're proposing, but you cannot cancel 20-some% of your electorate. The same thing, Le Pen cannot run. And again, I am not sympathetic to their stance, but if you want to talk about the elites governing on behalf of the citizens and not over them, then you have to engage with your public. If migration is what's, driving most of that, opposition to the establishment, address the issue. You cannot pretend that it doesn't happen.
But Andrew, look, I've mentioned this. I've mentioned this to a number of speakers. I've spoken about the bifurcated nature of European strategy. Ukraine here, migrants in the Mediterranean. What are we going to do? Do you have a plan? Oh, well, yeah, sort of, maybe. I mean, that's not a strategy. It's nothing actually. And I agree with you 100%. I think if you cannot come up with a holistic strategy that addresses the priority areas that can get the people of Europe behind whatever needs to be done to secure its borders, and I am talking about the European space generally, you've got
Sure.
nothing. You've got absolutely nothing. But look, you made mention a few things during that, and one of which is the idea that it'll take 10 years for Germany to pull itself together and become like a normal actor, or, at least have a semblance of military power. I would argue that that may be an underestimation because they've really let the Bundeswehr run into the ground in quite a catastrophic way for themselves. I mean, but when we go back to what your recent articles were suggesting, that the West must rebuild military readiness.
Yes.
How do we address the rising cost of military capability, the declining recruitment rates, and the fading public support? Because they speak to a greater malaise involving things like corporate corruption and greed in the defense industry sector, where everything is overinflated. And I know that there are arguments to suggest, yes, we do need to have a $500 toilet seat because it's made out of titanium or carbon fiber, some rare thing hatched in a rare laboratory. But you can't tell me that there's no graft and corruption in that supply chain. That's just rubbish. Then there's the political complacency. The politicians, we've got them here in Australia. She'll be right, mate. Chinese having an air live fire exercise out in the Tasman Sea? No worries. No worries. The Royal Australian Navy didn't challenge them. The Royal Australian Air Force weren't to be seen. No worries. Let the Chinese fire off their things and then sail around Australia unchallenged. That's what I would imagine not a very good look for Australia and was a warlike act by China against Australia. And yet it never hit the headlines. It was not a controversy. It was a blip in a couple of the right-wing media outlets, and then no one else managed to come up with a coherent story as to why Australia and Australians generally should not tolerate this sort of behavior. So when you're looking at this sort of thing, Andrew, how are you going to come across or counter the complacency, the corporate greed and corruption in the defense industry base, which is costing us a fortune for one aircraft? Look at the Lockheed Martin JSF. Typical example, also a controversial piece of technology, depending on where you sit and stand or whatever in the military structure. Look at, for instance, we're looking at buying Virginia class submarines for AUKUS down here. This comes at a massive, massive cost to Australia. Can we run those submarines? Probably not. Will we have trouble crewing them? Absolutely. Who is doing the thinking in our centers of power, trying to counteract the very weaknesses that we've put upon ourselves, Andrew, is the question to you.
So the most important part of this, and I think what you touched upon, is critical to the survival of the West and our ability to deter and defend. I use the term we've lived through 20 years, 30 years of appeasement when it comes to Russia and China. I mean, with the Russians, I described how the Europeans were reacting or not reacting. With the Chinese, we've handed the jewels in the crown of our technology to the 1.4 billion communist state. We actually created the problem that we're trying to grapple with. I don't
Amen to
mind.
that.
Yeah, and John, Boeing should be selling aircraft, or Airbus. They should never be building them in China, because that is technology transfer. That's
Correct.
intellectual property. That's our technological culture.
Yep.
But coming back to the defense industrial sector, look, in the United States, when the Cold War ended, we had 51 defense and space contractors. Right now, we have five.
That's
Five
not good
major
for
defense.
competition. Yep.
This is that. So you really don't have, and the cost of development is such. We're now in the process of developing the sixth generation aircraft.
Mm.
So we have developed a philosophy of building ever more sophisticated weapons. You talk about titanium seats, kind of gold plated, and these are remarkable platforms, but we can produce them in very limited numbers because
Yep.
simply of the cost and the capability. I'll give you an example. Everybody in Europe now wants to buy the F-35, right? Fifth generation aircraft. So
Yep.
the Poles ordered 35 plus of the F-35s in 2020. You know how many they've received so far?
10.
One, and one for training.
Oh
Two
no.
platforms. The Finns have ordered 65 of those. When do you think they're going to get them? The Poles
2030.
ordered 250 SEP V3 M1A2 Abrams. This will be the most powerful, operational force. Again, when will they get them?
Mm.
So the problem is capacity. For example, in 2022, when the war in Ukraine started, we were producing about 14,000, 15,000 155 millimeter howitzer rounds per month. The Ukrainians were shooting 3 to 5,000 a day. So they were shooting in 3 days what we produced in a month. We've increased production now by 800% or so, but we're struggling with components because we offshored so much of it and we shrank it. And during those 20 years of GWAD, I said this there's a conference in Maryland. It's Airspace and Sea Expo organized by the U.S. Navy League, and I said we fought scheduled wars for 20 years against inferior adversaries. So we could say we need so much ordnance, just-in-time deliveries. Our logistics were not threatened. What you're describing in Australia, if you go into a state-on-state conflict, there'll be missiles flying at those boats, there'll be missiles flying at those aircraft. China and Russia will not sit still like Iraq, allowing us to amass forces before we move forward. We're in a different environment. And so what needs to happen is two things, in my view, and I wrote about it. Number one, we need to rethink what we produce and what kind of platforms we produce, because we're looking at the levels of attrition we never suspected. If you look at the battlefield in Ukraine, and I hope we would fight differently, we would control the airspace and cyber, and we would control, space domain. But still, attrition rates. And that also means we need reserves. I wrote an article recently for RealClearDefense as well, that we need to return to national military service in the United States for two reasons.
And Australia.
Okay, I'll second you there. And I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
So, number one, we need the reserves in the event of an all-out war, number one.
Correct.
And number two, we're such a diverse country. You can go through your entire existence in the United States and never exit your social class, live in a gated community, never interact with anybody outside of that unless they come in as your service workers and do something. In a republic like ours, we need a place where people spend at least 6 to 12 months sweating together, doing things together, training together, discovering that citizenship is not just rights, but it's also obligations, that there's a nation out there they owe something to.
And that it's universal among, social class and among ethnic groups and sectarian groups.
100%.
And look, this is the failure of multiculturalism, Andrew. And this is something that the United States and settler communities in particular, the United States, Australia, Canada, New Zealand,
Sure.
we're all having to try to struggle with what we are, because we are so many, and yet we have to act as one. And if we lose the capacity to act and think as one, if we lose the universal characteristic that as a human citizen in the United States or in Australia, you have to be part of being a stakeholder in that nation. You're not just an autonomous unit moving around in a particular community that you feel comfortable in. You're an American, you're an Australian. We lost that. We lost that quite some time ago. And frankly, I don't know. I think that there are too many. Oh God, I'm gonna have to declare it. There are too many woke left-leaning people out there who have built their empires on creating this perfect system of unity and diversity, and that don't worry about it. We can live with parallel communities and everything will be fine. They don't see the military necessity for unity, national unity. They don't see the utility of communitarian values anymore. I mean, crikey, whatever happened to those things? The very thing that used to get us up and motivate us for national efforts, whether it was for war or peace, like building huge infrastructure projects, which we used to do here in Australia, was the fact that we all mucked in and did it. But now, oh no, I can't be fagged. Nah, not interested. Nah, what's in it for me? I mean, all this kind of what we're doing is we're effectively got a society, or we've got a collection of societies that are white-handing each other. And I'm not saying, for instance, that the alternative is to go down Putin's path or Xi's path. I mean, they've got their own problems, and I don't want those problems at all. But again, against enemies that are implacable, against enemies that have a vision where we have no vision, they win.
So, John, you touched on something that I've been thinking about and writing about. I'm on the board of the Tocqueville Foundation, which is run by the descendants of Alexis de Tocqueville, the guy who wrote
Yep.
Democracy in America. And we do an annual conference. I think it's called Tocqueville Conversations.
Mm.
And 2 years ago, I recommended, and we ran one on citizenship, on what citizenship entails. I invited General Cavoli, who was at that time Supreme Allied Commander, to come and speak. And Chris said something absolutely critical. He said, to whom a lot is given, much is expected of, which means the elites have a responsibility for the nation, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, there's a saying in the military, officers eat last, because it means that you need to earn through servant leadership, you need to earn the trust and the right to then order those men and women into a situation that may be almost, not only risky, but maybe deadly. And you have to earn that right to do it. We've lost that idea of citizenship. And the second thing is, you talked about multiculturalism. Your country and my country is so diverse in terms of our ethnic backgrounds that the thing that binds us together is the American DNA. It's the idea of what we believe in. It's the Constitution. It's our culture. It's the fact that we make immigrants into Americans, or at least we used to, because I think you're absolutely right that we have abandoned that responsibility and we've balkanized to a large extent. If you use group categories in a democracy like yours and mine, then you end up with a fracturing nation. And as I always, I used to teach at the Naval War College, and I would tell my captains over there, it's not navies or armies that go to war, it's nations that go to war.
Yeah, we've forgotten that.
Yeah, think why we say in the United States about the guys who went to fight against Tojo and Hitler as the greatest generation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
These were tough hombres. These were kids of the Great Depression. And, they worked farms, they worked factories, they slaughtered animals. When they got into the military, they were probably underweight, unlike today, where obesity is one of the huge issues that we're facing in America when it comes to recruiting young men and women into the military. When they got a cot, 3 squares a day, a pack of cigarettes, that was a good deal. But most of all, they were bound together by, and I'm not afraid to say this, by patriotism, sense of pride and commitment to the nation. This is what we need to rebuild. It may very well be that the largest ethnic component of, Americans of European origins are Germans, but our culture is post-British settler, post-Enlightenment, the language, the institutions, the rule of law. We're Albion's seed, and you, to some extent, are also that. I joke sometimes that our forefathers were kicked out of every decent country in the world, and that's really true, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm driving at is we need to return to the basics of what makes us a nation state. We are not, we need to come back to a melting pot in America. And the elites used to do that. That's what public schools used to do. Right now, we talk about a tossed salad kind of a view where all the ingredients are here that taste wonderfully, you can contemplate them, but they don't add up to one coherent entity. And I think our adversaries know it. And they know that as long as we're divided, regardless of our wealth, it'll be very hard to go for it. Now, after all this pessimism, I'll say one thing that I absolutely believe in. I think democracies are unbeatable when mobilized around a common cause, because you can't defeat a volunteer. Dictatorships can order people around and push them. The minute things go wrong, dictatorships fracture, and so, but what we need is leadership to articulate, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, of what has to be done, that citizenship is not just rights, but it's also obligations, that you are obligated to preserve this republic because it's such a precious gift, that was given to us by the founders and people who went and fought. And coming back to a European Union conversation, look, the reason I'm so skeptical, the United States fought a civil war, which was about slavery, but it was also about competing nationalisms. I mean, had the South won, there would have been probably 2 American republics in North America. And I'm delighted the South lost that war. And we became a nation state as a result of that. We started speaking ungrammatically. Every language that I know, the United States is plural, right?
Mm,
It's in American English that you say the United States is. So we're
mm,
speaking ungrammatical because we became a nation state as a result of that.
yep.
And I think we need to preserve this. And I think Australia needs to do exactly the same thing. Look at what's happening in Europe. I was talking to a friend of mine in Paris, and she said, we live with parallel communities.
Mm.
Are we still a French nation? As such, can we count on standing up to fight to defend what we stand for?
See, where I think we get it so wrong here in Australia, and I suppose I can see echoes of that in the United States as well. There has been, over the last 30 years, a real push against the English inheritance that the United States came from, that Australia came from. Somehow we woke up one day and everything that was British or British derived was evil, bad, terrible, responsible for every conceivable crime in the world. All you had to do was go to Africa, go to India, go to other parts that were under the sun never sets on the British Empire and see how they fared and what their attitudes were. And they were all pushing back in the post-colonial. I want to become something like the British, but I don't want to admit that the British had anything good to give, you know. And I think that we bought that, we drank the Kool-Aid, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, okay, what is Australia? Well, Australia is a country that was founded by Britain. The United States was. So it is only natural that the dominant culture, the dominant political cultural settings, the dominant social cultural settings will derive from Britain. Why should that now be considered terrible? Whereas before, it was the thing that allowed people to escape the old world, come into the new world, and experience something different, to escape the tragedies that they had left behind, whether it was, I don't know, anywhere in, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, elsewhere. These are the things that I think we need to come to grips with. And I don't see the politicians, our elites, as you say, are even in the room having this discussion. They're quite content seeing the parallels and playing one group off against the other. I mean, we see it here in our post GWAT, um, counterterrorism activities where Muslims are pitted against Jews and Jews against Muslims. And we see this now obviously playing out in the streets all over the West with regard to Gaza. There should be none of this. These are old wars in old countries. In the new countries, we need to rise above that. Not one political leader is saying that in the so-called Anglosphere. And I suppose it gets my goat particularly because when I did my Master of Arts by Research at Flinders University, I I posited a question. Could multicultural Australia mobilize for war? And I did it at a time when multiculturalism wasn't just a descriptive anymore, it was becoming ideology. You would not believe the pushback that I got
Mm.
from almost everybody. But thankfully, I had a core of supporters at the university who understood what I was saying and redirected me and made my language a little less confrontational. But that was where I came from because as a child of migrants, I saw a problem here. I saw that we were moving away from what made Australia stable, a great community, and a go-getter country. And now look where we are. We've got not much to sort of hang our shingle on, shall we say. I mean, yes, we're rich, but the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, no one can afford a house. Young people aren't having kids anymore. The price of living is going through the roof. I mean, all the same things that you guys are having over there. And because we've got that lack of communitarian values, even in the political parties, there are not enough common sense people in the political parties who can articulate the social and economic problems that we're going through to bring back the very things that we were saying. The universal rights of American citizen, the universal rights of the Australian citizen. Now it's about, the handful of oligarchs that are running us and to keep them fat, rich, and happy. I mean, you can't defend a country with that mentality.
John, I
I'll
think
get off my perch
no,
now,
no,
Andrew.
yeah, I know, I know. No, 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 I will add to this something that I find very important. Look, if there is no coherent nation, it's very hard to sustain working democratic institutions for one reason.
Yep.
It is only when you feel this connection to your fellow citizen will you restrict your own desires and, will pay taxes, demands for this, that, and the other. I'm not trying to be Machiavellian, but there's a degree of, venality and humanity. We're not just good people. We have all sorts of bad instincts. And the sense of belonging to a nation, kind of imagined extended community, if you will, is critical to actually tempering some of those elements. And we either are governed by laws or by men. If you start fracturing as a nation, you're increasingly governed by men, and those men, as you said, are playing elements against each other. I think all of this started pretty much, at least in the case of the United States. I don't know Australia as well as you do, obviously, in the late 1960s, and kind of began to decompose that sense of the cultural DNA. A lot of responsibility here lies with our educational institutions. We have focused too much on the dark aspects of the West and not enough on the positive and great achievements of the West. And, the demand that we either be perfect or be condemned as a civilization, to me, is just silly. We don't have to be perfect. We just have to be better than the alternatives out there. And we are, as a civilization. I believe, if you look at the idea of progress and the notion that you can actually do science, be objective, if you look at Christianity that undergirds our tradition, all of this should be celebrated, not bemoaned. It doesn't mean that you walk away from mistakes, from crimes, from horrible things that also happen within our civilizational realm. I mean, Holocaust, the Germans will never live it down. The tragedy of Stalinism and the brutality, the Russians will never, now, I don't think the Russians are really part of the West, but that's a separate conversation. I don't know how to rebuild it, but I'm trying to do it in my own small way. I'm here at the University of Florida now. I accepted a professorship at the Hamilton School for Civic and Classical Education. And we're trying to restore the traditional curriculum, great books, great texts of geopolitics, looking at the legal aspects that undergird the West. I'm really impressed that this is beginning to happen in American universities worldwide. It's not just, in the country as a whole, not just here in Florida. Here, the legislature stepped up and said, we will give you the resources to rebuild this program. I think if we don't reform our educational system from elementary through middle school, high school, and then universities in a way that teach young men and women pride in our culture and our tradition, we're going to spiral downwards. And I once said that Rome didn't collapse because it had a higher standard of living than the barbarians. It's just that barbarians were hatchet happy. They liked to rape and pillage and kill. And we were debating, things that were not that relevant. The West used to be muscular. There is a reason why it colonized so much of the world. There is a reason why Australia exists. When I think of somebody like Columbus, getting on that boat, a piece of wood, basically saying, I'm going to go out there and we'll see what we discover. We've lost that sense of assertiveness, of self-confidence and pride. And I think this can be brought back, but it will require real leadership. And, managers who emerged in this era of prosperity, I think there will be replaced by real leadership, because as crisis, begins to confront us, I believe firmly that free people, men and women, will step up to provide the leadership that we need and speak directly to the public.
There's been an ongoing debate, which I'm sure you're aware of, about the role of masculinity in society. And just listening to what you've said, risk-taking is an inherently masculine enterprise. That's what created the empires. That's what created greatness in terms of architecture and all kinds of stuff, because that's what men do. But now we're living during a time where everything that is male is toxic. No one wants to see any benefit in maleness. And we're so eager to walk away from the past that we're risking our future based on the idea that we can live in a soft, mollycoddled society where mummy will always take care of us and that we don't have to think for ourselves and we don't have to challenge ourselves. And the world out there is dangerous, so close your door and stay inside. Preferably go into your basement and stay on the computer watching porn until your eyes bleed. You know, this is the sort of society that we've willingly created. I mean, I'm so heartened by what you've said, Andrew. I just see that we have a long way to go and many discussions, rational ones. I'm not talking about the loony fringes, rational discussions about what men and women can positively contribute to each other as opposed to seeing each other as enemies or as combatants in a social game where one side is trying to best the other. I mean, it comes down to the fundamentals of who we are as human beings. We can't afford that sort of hostility. And I'm not saying that we need to go back to a male dominated, but we need to society, but we need to find a balance where reasonable men and women can look at each other and say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. Yeah, you know, you've got your role and I've got my role, and we can all go about and create a life together. Not this sort of engendered divorce that we see play out even in the universities, and the way that, you know, things like foreign policy, when we're discussing foreign policy now, that now we have got a gender attached to it. I mean, what is that? I'm sorry. Foreign policy is about groups of people, not a specific gender coming to the party with a particular plan. It's about men and women. We've kind of forgotten that along the way. And I think that this adds another layer of complexity to what you and I are both fighting against in our respective countries, I think.
So, John, I mean, I actually think that the obsessions about gender and roles and all of that, uh, to me, that should be set aside, and we should focus on citizenship. And the citizens are both men and women,
Yeah, sure.
and we're part of the same nation.
Mm,
You touched on something that I wrote about several years ago for Politico. I called it Zero Risk Society. Was it maybe it was a National Review piece that I wrote? I don't remember exactly. But my point is that Western societies have been told that risk not only can but should be eliminated.
yes.
And we need to relearn how to live with risk in a way. Leadership to me is being able to hold two contradictory uh, courses of action, making a decision, accepting the possibility that it may fail, but be willing to again move and address the problem until you succeed in solving it. It's not being afraid to fail. It's not being afraid to take risks. If we want to remain free, I believe we will have to fight for our freedom, both figuratively and literally.
Yeah.
And most importantly, we have to relearn how to live with risk. I have to tell you, the experience of the pandemic to me was one of the most depressing sights that I've seen,
Mm,
because it epitomized this zero risk society. I can imagine the initial fear of the unknown. We did not know what that virus could do.
yeah.
But this kind of willingness to say to the government, I will agree to anything you want me to do. I will lock myself out. I will imprison myself. Just keep me safe.
Mm,
I think that also reflects something that happened in the West, where we become less and less kind of connected to our Christian roots. And if you believe that your entire existence is only here and now, you've got nothing beyond that to look forward to or to believe in, that sure, your life becomes only here and now. So we need to relearn how to take risks. I think we need to relearn also that what you said, that we as a society, both male and female, families, all the aspects that constituted the traditional core of Western civilization. And there's something else. I had a conversation recently with one of my students here about the meaning of tolerance.
mm,
And to me, it's patiently enduring what I may disagree with, but I respect my fellow citizen.
yeah.
So I will not go against him or her, unless, of course, they're breaking the law.
Mm,
If you date underage children, I'm going to report you to the police and the rest of it. So my point is, but it's not the same thing as affirmation.
yes.
I think we got to the point that tolerance is confused is taken for affirmation. And if you do not affirm something that you believe, even though I don't believe that, then somehow I'm deficient and defective. So we need to restore what is critical for citizens is both acceptance and tolerance, but acceptance of difference, but within the boundaries of what civilized society should be able to do. We used to be able, compromise was mother's milk of democracy. We fought very hard in the election. I win, you lose, we shake hands. We live in this quasi-Bolshevik environment.
Yeah.
I win, you disappear. I win, and I will eliminate you from politics. It's not that I'm going to hold your feet to the fire and then we'll go at it again. Every single time we question our democratic institutions, we're undermining what it took generations to build, because our democratic culture is not what's written on paper. It's what we have internalized. Democracy means that people lose elections and accept the outcome, right? And now we're staring at the Chinese offering a large portion of the globe a completely different form of governance. I call it a free market for unfree people, the kind of commercial communism that monitors everything. And we're losing that ideological competition because we lack the sense of self, of what we are as the West. This is what we need to reclaim.
Yes, and just on that, I mean, there's been a lot said about the Russians having interfered in the American political process, the Chinese, running influence operations here in Australia. To what degree is this externally driven that we're all suffering, the slings and arrows of our laziness and thinking strategically? Or is it really, a series of own goals because we just forgot what we were and we don't really want to do the hard work and clawing all those glory days back?
I think what happened at the end of the Cold War is that we used too much of our own product, so to speak. We drank Kool-Aid.
Yep.
We interpreted the end of the Cold War as this grand ideological victory. And the worst thing that happened was we disconnected national security priorities from economic policy. During the Cold War, you couldn't sell the Soviets an Intel-based PC because it was considered dual-use technology. Here we took the jewels and the crown, we gave it to the Bolshevik state, to the Chinese communist state. And the assumption was, Jeffersons will rise, China will become a responsible stakeholder. All this nonsense.
Yeah, completely.
And so we need to relearn the basics of statecraft.
That takes work, though.
Yeah, I find it appalling that a lot of American companies right now are not really American companies anymore. They're transnational.
Yes.
If you start working for a French company, you're not likely to walk around and say French food is terrible, French wine is terrible. You become, in effect, a spokesperson for your employer. If you look at the amount of investment that comes from China, if you look at the acquisitions, the Russians were buying out. I mean, in Germany, KUKA Robotics, one of the best robotics companies, is 100% owned by China. So German engineers are working for the People's Liberation Army. We educated Chinese engineers in our universities and laboratories. So when you talk about the influence, we have Confucian institutes that were shaping the narratives. I don't know if that was also the case in Australia.
Big problem here.
Yeah, so if you allow your adversary unrestricted access to your society, while at the same time your adversary walls off its internet, controls and monitors how you interact, well, guess what's going to happen? What you're going to have is partial elite capture and a tremendous amount of political influence, direct or indirect, because we're open and free societies. So we need to figure this out. As you probably know, for the last 20 years, I've been writing and calling for decoupling from China. I mean, arguing that unless we reshore our industry, friendshore if we can't reshore because of labor arbitrage and other considerations, but we should never continue to do what we've been doing. Look at the German car industry today. The Chinese are just about to destroy it. And to increase the balance of payment and to improve the situation, Wang Yi went and said, you want to trade with us? Well, we want to buy the lithography machines that the Dutch are producing to produce high-end chips here. Or the conversation with President Trump, allow us to buy NVIDIA high-end chips and will in exchange buy some of your soybeans. This kind of conversation. It look, we lived in a world where political scientists argue that there's complex interdependence. I've got news flash for those political scientists. There is nothing complex about dependence. There's just
Mm,
dependence. And it's a
mm,
question who depends on whom for what. And we've created a situation where the Chinese are producing about 35%, if not more, of global industrial output. My country now produces only 17%. And it flipped in just a decade. We have a 37 trillion national debt, John. We
mm.
added 8 trillion over the COVID and other pumped empty liquidity into the system. We're spending more on servicing the debt right now than we're spending on our defense budget. These are the things we need to come to terms with. And the
Isn't
same,
that also, oh, sorry, Andrew. Isn't that also a case of if you are you're barely able to service your debt, and that figure is in excess of what you can afford for defense, doesn't that bespeak a material crisis in the United States because you just can't afford anything anymore, right?
well, that's true, but Neil Ferguson he talks about the Ferguson law. It's not
Yeah,
from
I've
him,
heard
it's
of
from
that.
another. You've heard about it, that if a
Yeah,
country spends more, it won't be a great power much longer. But look,
correct.
the problem is structural. I'm now in a country where the government has shut down completely. It's shut down for a month now.
Yeah.
And there is no kind of sign that there will be some sort of a compromise. And it's a situation where air traffic controllers are not paid. Until recently, our service personnel in the military was not paid. This is a problem of our politics and the structural kind of issues we need to address. Having said that, the United States is an incredibly a rich country in terms of resources, manpower, educational institutions. We're a huge country. We're grossly underpopulated. Well, I shouldn't be saying this to the Australian. How many Australians are out there for your vast continent that you basically control? So the
Yeah, yeah, but
U.S.
we're a desert. We're a desert. You guys have got more
That's
temperate
true.
climate.
That's
We've just
true.
got
So
a
you
lot of
cluster
dry
on the you
space.
cluster on the shore. Yeah, no, I
Yep.
understand. What I'm saying is, my point is, our problem is political.
Yeah.
It's the lack of strategy. It's the inability to put national interests first. It's this kind of disconnect from our corporate elites. We have digital aristocracy on the West Coast, financial aristocracy on the East Coast, and they don't feel really connected to the heartland. There's a term I heard at a dinner party that I found very offensive: flyover country. And I said,
Oh, yes.
you want to govern, at least like your fellow citizens,
Yeah.
address their needs, talk to them.
Mm,
And if you look at American politics, we're going through probably the third most profound crisis in the history of the Republic, but we will pull through. It's going to be ugly and messy and nasty,
mm,
but we will pull through. Because there's one thing that I think Western societies have, it's the ability to reinvent themselves and to move forward. So my money is on us, not on the dictators right now. But we're
mm.
facing an axis of dictatorships, John. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and we're fragmented. We're arguing. We're internally divided. That's the real problem.
You're with the Focus podcast, where we bring you the world's leading thinkers straight to you. If this discussion resonates, leave us a comment. We'd love to hear a perspective on the future of the West. God, Andrew, I'm getting kind of disheartened. I've got a little bit of
Don't
hope.
be.
I've got a little bit of hope
Don't
there.
be.
Yeah, but see, I'm disheartened only because there's an old saying in Australia that we're always 15 years behind the United States. So I see that in 15 years we're going to be, in a slightly worse situation than we are because we'll incorporate a lot of Americanisms, which are failing as we speak, before we also swing the pendulum the other way. So we've got a little bit of road to kick the can down, shall we say. Makes me a little bit less happy about the situation from an Australian perspective, at least. But I'm glad to see that the United States is taking some road toward recovery, because at the moment Um, oh God, you know, we've done just so much damage to our civilization. We've walked away from things like forward planning, thinking for the future, thinking about our children, thinking about where we want them to be, because drives another question that's all about the levels of technology that we've got, which aren't helping us. They should be helping us, but they're not. And again, I suppose the one thing that I can say about things like social media platforms and AI, it's the same problem that resonates in defense industries. You mentioned earlier that, you know, there was a time not that long ago that you would have 30 plus defense contractors out there and each would be competing to get the best contract and they'd come up with the best price to give to the US government so they could buy their kit. Well, you know, then there was the consolidation. You've got five and they dictate the market, and that's it. The US government either pays or they don't get their JSF on time. Um, I suppose the tech industry is working along the same way. I mean, you've got, you know, four or five major Silicon Valley companies, and they dictate to the government and to the public what they end up with, and they don't like the regulation in the United States. They don't like this, they don't like that, they don't like something else. So basically, they're creating the space that makes them feel comfortable to keep collecting the profits while their technology is undermining the very fabric of our society. You know, if we think about the lack of discourse, the lack of conversations like the one that we're having right now, you know, rational, a bit cold-blooded, you know, but things that need to be said, we won't get that on many social media channels. We won't even get that on the Twitter feed. Oh, well, the Twitter feed. Do we even call that? Well, the X feed now. I mean, God help me. And you know, I know I sound like an old fuddy-duddy, and I suppose I am, but
No, John, you don't. No, no, no.
yeah.
Let me tell you one thing though, because I remember when I came back from Germany, and if you walk in the streets of American cities, um, people are glued to their headsets and to their iPhones and to their, so the world becomes a 6 inches kind of screen.
Yeah.
And I would take metro to a subway from Georgetown where I lived. I would walk to Foggy Bottom and then I would go to my office at the Atlantic Council. Took me 7 months before I saw a young woman read a book. The rest of it was headsets in the ears and the finger constantly going up and down. There's a wonderful book that Haidt wrote, The Anxious Generation. I am appalled by what I call the tyranny of algorithm. The way of it was supposed to simplify our lives, and in fact, it has fractured us even more, and the societal interaction almost disappears. But coming back to the monopolies that we've created, I started in this business with Ronald Reagan, mainly in his second term. But I remember in the first term when he broke, the monopoly of American telecommunication systems.
Mm.
That opened up space for digital innovation. I remember when I was at Stanford University, Google was a rag hanging over the university bookstore, and a lot of kids on PCs, doing Facebook, the same thing, on and on and on. If today 90% of your searches are done using Google's engine, this is a monopoly like you haven't seen. And if most of the people get their information through the algorithm that these companies provide, then we need to treat them the same way as we treated radio waves or television waves. Either break them up or treat them as public utilities and regulate the daylights out of them. Why am I saying this? Look how little innovation there is now. Um,
Right,
you
right.
know,
But Andrew, don't you guys in the United States have antitrust laws that were
we
designed
do.
specifically to break up the monopolies in
We
order
do,
to
but we
keep
don't enforce
competition?
them. But John, we don't enforce them because in the United
Oh,
States, the money is political speech.
yeah, it
You
is.
can organize a PAC, you can do all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
What's the dream of every congressman? I mean, if you think about it, in our system, if you're in the House of Representatives, you're on a 2-year cycle, which means the first year you're paying off the debts, quote unquote, politically speaking,
Mm.
that you have incurred while you were running for election or reelection. In the second year, you're working for reelection. The Senate is a little different. It's, the cycles are 6 years. It's more deliberative and whatnot. But at the same time, public service was not supposed to be a lifetime form of employment.
Mm. Mm.
And yet we have politicians, actually, I don't know how it is in Australia. You know this better than I do, but we need generational changes.
Mm.
We still have baby boomers in key positions.
Oh, look, here in Australia, just for your edification, if I may, we have a number of politicians who went straight from university into political office
And never
with
left.
absolutely no idea of how the real world works. And yet all of a sudden they're sitting in charge of a portfolio that they really don't have the experiential background to
Of course.
manage. So again, there has been a what can I say that isn't so offensive? Oh, screw it, I'll say it anyway. There's been a dumbing down of the process, you know?
Yeah, if you think of the Biden presidency in the United States, I mean, to me, there were aspects of it that were truly tragic.
Yep.
I remember talking to a friend of mine who is an MD, and he said, what Joe Biden had was classic symptoms of Parkinson's, dementia. We now know he actually also had prostate cancer, possibly terminal.
Yep.
And yet the media and all the people around him maintain this fiction of how switched on Joe is, he how alert he is.
Mm.
A young republic like ours, we're going to celebrate 250 years of statehood. Now, it's for a democracy that's pretty old, actually. We still operate on the same, 18th century Constitution.
Mhm.
Constitution is king in America. We venerate it. The French are on their fifth republic. I like to joke sometimes while we're still in the same mode.
Yep.
But we desperately need the younger generation to get into politics. When I worked at the Atlantic Council, I would tell my staffers, brilliant young men and women, we had pick of the litter, the best universities. I said, go back to Wisconsin, go back to Alabama, run for state office, from there move to national office. We need your generation to step in. And unfortunately, if you look at some of our senior leadership at the congressional level,
Mm.
I remember when Senator Feinstein, before she passed away, may she rest in peace, I mean, she wasn't coherent. She would sit, who was governing? Who was making decisions? Staffers?
Mm.
I remember one senator telling me, Andrew, our leaders are too damn old, including me. And I kind of thought, Senator, I didn't say that. Senator, there's a solution here. It's called retirement. So one
But
aspect,
why don't they? Why don't they? I mean, is it greed that keeps them in their position? I mean, and I'm not saying greed about the monies that they get for being in political office, but the greed of power. Once you acclimatize yourself to political power, it's almost like a drug. It's hard to remove yourself from that because
well,
if
and in
it
our
wasn't, if it wasn't, people would retire. People would say, I'll get out while the going is good. I'm still young enough to enjoy my life. Why do I have to stress myself out in this high stress environment? Because let's face it, politics, you and I may poke fun at our politicians, but it is a hard job. And it's a job that not very many people would stick their hand up and volunteer themselves for, especially since you're going to be in the public light 24/7, being criticized by all a sundry, right?
yeah, of course. But the idea that you serve in an office for 2, 3 terms, maybe at the congressional level, maybe 2 terms in the Senate, and you go back to the farm, so to speak, or you go back to your enterprise, you go back to your business, that has pretty much disappeared in terms of how we look at our political class. And I think it's very unfortunate because I think losing the connection with the electorate, the reason why you have all these movements that are being dismissed as populist movements, basically when I see European elites saying, well, this, that party, they're just a bunch of populists, it simply means that you're unwilling to engage with people who
Mm.
are communicating dissatisfaction. The election of Donald Trump in 2016, that was a clear message to the elites, to the inside the Beltway crowd. We're not happy with what you're doing. We want things to be done differently. And I remember saying to a colleague in 2016 after the election, I hope our elites put their heads down, eat some humble pie, and say, how did we screw up so badly that we lost all the trust? But instead, you had, impeachment, you had, and whether you like Donald Trump or not, there was one aspect when he was almost, his opposition was trying to drive him out of politics altogether. You know, it takes tenacity and persistence, your livelihood, your family, to assassination attempts. I mean, it takes guts to persevere and keep going. Um, is what's happening in the United States, an orderly transition or no, it's rough, it's chaotic.
Yeah.
Do we have a strategy? I don't think we do. But one thing that I think the nation now realizes is the establishment political parties need to change. We need a new set of policies. Now, whether or not the political parties learned the lesson, that's a different story. Um, I hope in Europe there will be the ability to listen to the public. It doesn't mean that you have to endorse political programs, of AfD or the National Front or whatever, but you cannot ignore the citizens. If migration is a key issue that's driving the fury of people who say, I don't want to live in a city where I don't feel any connectivity, where I can't walk into the street, crime rates, this, that, and the other, then it's your responsibility as a representative, elected representative, to address that. It's beginning to happen slowly in Europe. It's happening on a massive scale in the United States. And of course, it's become politicized, how you deal with illegals. And I'm sure a lot of decent people get caught up in this, and you'll find cases where this is happening. But to me, the right to invite somebody to your home, that's the most sacred right of every free person. And American immigration policy used to operate that way. We had a quota system in terms of, who can come in. Ellis Island was there for a reason, health screening, making sure that you're not getting people into the country who are not going to contribute and become a liability. We somehow lost all of this.
Yeah.
It's basically, I mean, if you look at what was happening at the southern border, it was an organized smuggling of people. I mean, this was not that we're just getting Mexicans or Central Americans or South Americans. We're getting Chinese, we're getting Pakistanis, Indians, because you could get on the plane out of Istanbul, fly to Mexico City, and then, the operators would get you there. We need to restore control of our borders. If you don't control the borders, you're not a country. And then for people who are here, you need to make sure that they acculturate, that they become Americans. The pattern used to be, the immigrants coming in, if they were Irish, they had a leg up because they spoke English. But if they were Italian or German or Polish, they clustered initially. So you have Little Italy, you've got Hamtramck, Michigan, Frankenmuth, where they still do Beer Fest in Michigan. But then the second generation would disperse and would become more American than anybody else, because that is what they learned at school, civics, English. And the third one could rediscover some of their ethnicity, kiss me, I'm a Latvian, or this kind of stuff. But they were as American as they could possibly be. We need the melting pot to come back into our
Amen.
conversation. We need
Amen
to
to that.
restore the sense of national connectivity.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you prevent people from celebrating their heritage. I just attended a wonderful Indian wedding. I have to tell you, it was incredible.
Mhm.
And these were very successful Americans of Indian origin. And they, of course, their relatives also came in from India. They celebrated their culture and they celebrated their freedom. It was wonderful. We are, as the West, uniquely capable of absorbing people into our culture. I would submit to you, no other culture can do that. I cannot imagine you immigrating to China and feeling like you become Chinese. No, you will always be a
A foreign.
foreigner, no,
Yes.
no matter what happens to you, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So,
So I
yeah,
think there's a lot of positive about our civilization, John, that we should
mm,
celebrate, and we
I
should transmit that to our children.
I absolutely agree with you. And I just hope that there's going to be oh, if I get that word right, proliferation of discussions like the one that we're having, where we can see a path forward and rectify the own goals that we have scored over the last 30 odd years. Now, Andrew, if we could just, briefly go back to higher strategy, if you don't mind, before we wrap up. If the US, China, and Russia, as I suspect they are are all overstretched. I mean, yes, Russia has got their civilisational mission, trying to reconquer the Slavic core of Russia and all that kind of thing. But they're not doing such a great job in Ukraine, or at least they're underwhelming in Ukraine, which suggests that they too are overstretched. Are we entering a period of a post superpower era shaped by regional powers and limited wars? Because even with China, China, you made the point earlier in the podcast that with regard to that, it's building up a huge modern military, and we saw it on display only recently when they were celebrating their whatever they were celebrating.
Yes.
But yes, and it looked frightening and spectacular, just like the Korean marches, the North Korean marches look frightening and spectacular. But I'm always wondering. China fought its last war, and again, that was 1979 against Vietnam, and they got thoroughly spanked for their efforts by the Vietnamese. Now, okay, we were talking about China with a largely peasant guerrilla army at the time, no modern weapons included. But what gives us the idea that the Chinese are well and truly over it? What do they have no corruption in their military industry complex? Are we that confident that they can fight a war which they have not fought for, well, since 1979? The US and Russia now have got recent military experience, and every generation they end up in some sort of conflict, which means that in the military there's always a core of people that know how to, march on a straight line. Well, I don't know, the US military parades, that the last one looked really not very spectacular, but anyway, that's another story. But at least they can get a rifle and shoot someone dead. Um, are we confident that China is the sort of power that we think it is, or is it a chimera? Is it just an illusion? That China has got its propaganda ministries organizing these massive parades to demonstrate power, and yet really that power is more like a piece on a chessboard rather than a piece to be used. Because China, don't forget, is a Confucian society or a Confucian civilization, to put it to you another way. And their thinking is not American thinking. Their thinking isn't even Russian thinking. Their thinking is something completely different. They've got the long view. They've got this idea that if we fight without fighting, or go to war without fighting, that is the victory. And I can start seeing some of those pieces coming together, because the more they put their military programs forward and the more intimidated we are, the more likely we'll concede ground to China without actually putting up a fight, because we're afraid of actual kinetic conflict with the Chinese. How true do you think that is?
It's really interesting to me if you look historically at my country. In system transforming wars like World War I, World War II,
Hmm.
the United States was always the last to engage. It suffered the least amount of casualties and then called the shots in terms of political settlement. That was, Wilson didn't succeed with his own League of Nations because the Senate voted against it. But then after the Second World War, the United States proved instrumental in setting the terms after that conflict. Paradoxically, the Chinese are doing this right now. The Chinese are sitting on the sidelines. We're trading our stocks and some of our very expensive capabilities. I mean, a missile for the Patriot battery is about 2 million a pop. So there's one aspect that worries me. Number two, I look at the Chinese. Russia and China are described in our last national security strategy. Russia as an acute threat and China as a pacing threat. I think both descriptions are incorrect. Russia is not an acute threat in the sense that it kind of all of a sudden erupted. It's going to be a chronic threat as long as this imperial narrative is alive that I talked about.
Yep.
China is in a league of its own. It's an existential threat. And here's why, in my view. If you look at the Belt and Road Initiative and you actually look at what it portends, countries that are now about 150 countries that are in some way connected to this project. It's an attempt to build a land-based supply chain network, defended, connected to maritime connectivity, and in effect flipping Europe from being a gateway for the United States into becoming a tail end of the supply chain network, and then bid for regional hegemony in the Indo-Pacific. This is a pretty global strategy. the strategy 2049, when, China will celebrate the 100 years of the revolution, the objectives they set for their military, 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. 2027, be ready to act in the event of the need to blockade or take over Taiwan, which our intelligence assessments say this is what Xi has been arguing to his military. And again, that is an anniversary for the People's Liberation Army. The Chinese, in my view, are doing what every rising power has done. They're becoming geostrategically assertive. They want to control the Indo-Pacific. This is very bad news for your country if they
Yeah, I
succeed.
know.
Remember that even though that Navy that the Chinese are building has less tonnage than the US Navy, but numerically they have more ships than we do. Now, you're absolutely right. This is an untested military. This is untested Navy. Hasn't operated. The United States fought incessantly, granted against inferior enemies, but nonetheless, we have commanders who have been in the field. So we don't know how good that Chinese military is. And there was a degree of absurdity as I was watching that parade, with Xi standing in the car through the sunroof and, driving to every unit and
Yeah.
people screaming, greetings and whatnot.
Mm.
But remember one thing, if there is a crisis in the Indo-Pacific, if the Chinese decide, for example, to blockade Taiwan, they will be operating close to shore. They can use their land-based assets against us. We have tyranny of the distance. 90% of US military power is based in the continental United States. Remember when President Trump was praising the B-2 bombers,
Yes.
crews who flew for 37 hours out of Missouri to actually drop ordnance on the Iranian facility. That tells you what we have to struggle with.
Yep.
So again, I keep telling people who are saying, well, we should pull out of Europe. Well, being in Europe allows us to project power into the Middle East. Being in Korea, Japan, this allows us to project power as well. I think the Chinese will bid for regional hegemony and move from there, just like with the Soviets during the Cold War. Unless they're checked, deterred, and contained, this will continue. The problem is, we won the Second World War because we're the manufacturing powerhouse of the world. I mean, the United States could outproduce anyone. The Germans made much better tanks. Our Shermans were not that capable, but for every German Panther or Tiger, we produced 50 Shermans, and one of those Shermans put round up the Tiger, and that was the end of it. Food production, machine production, trucks, jeeps, airplanes. Well, look at it today. 80% of our antibiotics are coming out of China. When the pandemic started, we didn't have any PPE. We had to import it from China. Rare earth minerals right now, we're scrambling to build alternative sources of supply. The Chinese have radically centralized supply chain networks, basically using state power. And I think they're doing this on purpose. Their goal right now, this 14th five-year plan, is to essentially eclipse the United States in high technology. That's why the race in artificial intelligence, power generation, we woke up finally to realize that the Chinese economy no longer produces just components and screws and things that we can put into our systems, that they're actually now are poised to destroy the German car industry. They're poised to start competing in the high end of artificial intelligence and manufacturing and robotics and the rest of it. And all of this translates into the military. Now, one word of caution, just because you're a production powerhouse, it doesn't mean that you can build state-of-the-art weapon systems. It's a completely different problem sets. Here, the Russian aspect worries me tremendously, John, because the Russians have selectively invested in some aspects of military technology. For example, the propulsion systems for their attack submarines. They're orders of magnitude more quiet than they used to be during the Cold War. And that's why, because they had access to Western technology to use it. Hypersonics. The Russians have invested in their nuclear arsenal. We haven't. I mean, some of our pits are 40 years old. So we need to undo all of this. But again, to end on the optimistic note, I think we have the capacity to do this. We have the resources to do this. Over 60% of all transactions in the world are still dollarized. We have this tremendous asset of relying on the dollar as reserve currency. Of course, the Chinese are trying to displace this and move into renminbi. So if we, pardon me, get our act together, I'll say that, and move forward with a coherent strategy, start investing in science and technology, rethink how we educate our young, expand our industrial defense, industrial base by essentially making, again, contracts that stockpile at speed and scale, which is what we did during the Cold War. No more just-in-time delivery. We need redundancies in the system. And most of all, we need to mobilize our populations to become resilient again and to become focused on the task at hand, which is, defending our freedom and our liberty and our democracy. I will end on a proverb that a Russian general once told me. Up until 2008, we could have Russian officers in our courses at the Marshall Center after the invasion of Georgia that ended. And this one-star general said to me, there's a Russian saying, if you don't feed your own army, you're going to end up feeding somebody else's army. We need an investment in defense. We need to spend at a minimum 6% of our GDP. We need to build real exercise capabilities in Europe. And we need our Asian allies, like your country, to work closely with us, because individually we can be picked off. Together, I don't worry. We can take on our adversaries, deter them, and if need be, prevail.
Andrew, your writings remind us that strategy begins with heart, with what we value and defend. Whether the West comes together may depend on whether we can still tell a story worth believing in. Thanks for joining us on The Focus and for sharing your insights.
Thank you, John. Thank you for having me.
As Professor Michta reminds us, the real challenge for the West isn't only about power, it's about belief. Whether our democracies endure will depend not just on budgets or alliances, but on whether we still know who we are and what we stand for. Now, on to questions for the audience. Do you think the West can rebuild unity and purpose, or has the age of Western leadership already passed? Should Europe learn to defend itself without relying on the United States, or is transatlantic unity still essential for global stability? Professor Michta argues the West's real crisis is one of belief, not power. What values do you think the West must rediscover to renew itself? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producers of The Focus, Neil Smart and Lynn Sear. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at Bruni Doctor, and follow The Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on thefocuspodadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.